We're good to go.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural presentation for this year's speaker series on Mormonism and the Challenges of Whiteness. My name is Nathan Gorlick. I'm a professor in the English department here at UVU, and I'll be moderating the proceedings today. Before we begin, I want to let those of you watching on YouTube know a bit more about the structure of our proceedings this afternoon. This virtual speaker series is an academic project in which about 15 UVU students read and study some of the most current work of leading scholars on the series' core theme in advance of each scholar's virtual visit. These students are here today in a designated Zoom meeting, and their interventions will be prioritized during the discussion following our speaker's presentation. Now, I'll be monitoring the event's YouTube live feed for any questions those of you watching there might have, and you can type them into the chat window beside the video, and I'll ask them on your behalf. I promise I will do my best to include as many of these questions as possible, but because this series is designed as an engaged learning activity for our students, all of whom applied to the program and were selected by the organizing committee, and because we intend our conversation to surround the scholarly materials under consideration, I may not get to your remarks, but please know that we are very grateful for your attendance and participation, and we are excited to have you at this, our inaugural event, which is also the concluding event for this year's Ethics Awareness Week, hosted by UVU's Center for the Study of Ethics. Before we begin, I want to thank the other members of the organizing committee, Professors Brianne Larson and Boyd Peterson of the Department in English and Literature, Professor Brian Birch from Philosophy and Religious Studies and Director of the Center for the Study of Ethics, also Evan Jones for his technical support today, and finally our principal organizer, Professor Lydia Kerr, also from the English department, to whom I now turn over the proceedings so she can introduce our featured scholar.
Hi, everybody. Can you see me and hear me? Great. Okay, so bear with me if this doesn't seem relevant at first to our presentation today, but recently I decided to start reading David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest. I know. Only 10 pages in, I found myself laughing out loud in public as I took in Wallace's rendering of a meeting with some college deans. I am seated in an office, it begins, surrounded by heads and bodies. I am in here. 3 faces have resolved into place. These are 3 deans of admissions, academic affairs, athletic affairs. I do not know which face belongs to whom. I can't tell you why exactly, or maybe I can, just not here, but this scene had me in stitches. And my inability to stifle my laughter in public reminded me of a passage from an article by Peter Coviello, one I happened to publish in a journal I edited in graduate school way too many years ago. How to Do Things with Joy, it was called. In that piece, Peter described a similar experience reading Thomas Pynchon's Vineland in an airport in what he calls a downright Seussian United Airlines terminal. I am having an experience, he says, that will be familiar to anyone who has sat in the back of a board meeting, a synagogue, a classroom, any sufficiently austere locale will do, and been overcome with the unstoppable urge to cry out, veritably to shout with tremendous, inexcusable laughter. An old student of mine, he says, called this the church giggles, when you know you mustn't surrender to this wave of inappropriate hilarity, but feel the effort not to do so will cause such outrageous pressure to build up in your chest and behind your teeth that you will suffer some terrible bodily rupture, some ghastly internal implosion, and there you will be, inexplicably dead in the 4th pew. What Peter is talking about here is more than just books that make us laugh. It has to do with the excess joy of reading literature, that overabundance of pleasure that exceeds and hopefully outlasts all of our good, sound reasons for doing what we do as scholars, teachers, and students of texts. For many of us, I think this joy is out of bounds, or at least carefully cordoned off and stifled. We tend not to invite such experiences as we devise our sufficiently austere, critical interpretations for publication or at the classroom pulpit. And any students laughing in the 4th pew are likely to be docked participation points for being disruptive. What I love most about Peter's work, on the other hand, is the joy that exudes from his writing, the obvious pleasure he takes in reading texts of all kinds, even and especially in the book he'll talk to us about today. The students in the reading group have seen the smiley faces scribbled in the margins of my copy of Make Yourselves Gods. I'm not suggesting that this book is funny, though, though it did on a few occasions make me laugh out loud. What I'm trying to say is that his writing does things with joy. Professor Coviello specializes in American literature and queer theory in the Department of English at the University of Illinois, Chicago. His research considers the entangled histories of empire and intimacy in 19th century America, with particular attention to questions of secularism, biopolitics, and sex. He is the author of Intimacy in America, Dreams of Affiliation in Antebellum Literature, Tomorrow's Parties, Sex and the Untimely in 19th Century America, and Long Players, A Love Story in 18 Songs. He has written about Phyllis Wheatley, queer children, pop songs, prayer, the history of sexuality, step-parenthood, race and psychoanalysis, Pynchon, polygamy, and more than a few times, Prince. This work has appeared in PMLA, Raritan, ELH, GLQ, MLQ, and I would add Theory at Buffalo, that small publication I edited 15 years ago when I first began reading his work. His most recent book and the subject of our discussion today is Make Yourselves Gods, Mormons and the Unfinished Business of American Secularism, which appeared in 2019 from the University of Chicago Press, and I should say was a huge inspiration for the organization of this speaker series. To venture an all too brief summary, the book is about how the quote unquote bad belief of the 19th century Latter-day Saints transformed itself into the good religion of the church we know today. Peter will talk to us this afternoon about a chapter from midway through the text titled Wards and Sovereigns, Deviance and Dominion in the Biopolitics of Secularism. And I want to close really quickly with one of my favorite passages from Make Yourselves Gods, one marked in my copy by a smiley face and actually no other notes in the margin. It's a short paragraph that concludes the prologue and acts as an apologia for, or maybe more of a joyful announcement of, the delightsome tone Peter often takes in the rest of the book. I hope the passage can also help set the tone for our speaker series on Mormonism and the challenges of whiteness this year. Here's Peter again. When the rhetoric in what follows rises in pitch, when the argumentative style gives more latitude to Smithian prophetic extravagance than might seem proper to the cooler idioms of scholarly inquiry, know that there is a meta-claim at play, a methodological polemic, an effort, let's say, to breathe upon the embers of some still vital Mormon concepts, the divinizing mortal flesh in its journeying toward exaltation, for instance, in the hope that they might show us some of what yet remains in shadow, even in the glare of so much secular illumination. As Smith never tired of noting, doctrine is one thing, believing and receiving another. Make Yourselves Gods believes him. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Coviello.
Oh, well, I would wish for all of my colleagues and anyone who could see me an introduction as kind and as gracious as that. That's very, 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 that's very pleasing. And now I feel I'm just going to disappoint tremendously because there won't be enough laughs in this talk. I'm tremendously honored to be here, and I'm very grateful, especially to Lydia. As I was saying earlier, I know that putting things like this together is very difficult and cumbersome in the easiest of times, and these are, of course, not the easiest of times. And so I'm just very grateful. I'm very honored to be here, and I thank you all for joining me and joining us today. And I'll just to sort of tell you a little bit about what I want to do today and who I am. Like as Lydia mentioned, I'm a professor of English, which is to say I am not a religious historian, for instance. And I often get asked, neither am I a practicing Mormon, it should be said. And I often get asked, like, why did you write a book about Mormonism? And part of the answer is, well, I wrote this other book a number of years ago which was about the history of sexuality and about sexuality in 19th century America. And it just kind of occurred to me that like, you probably oughtn't to write a book about the history of sexuality in 19th century America and not talk about one of the largest sex scandals of the 19th century, which is of course Mormon polygamy. And probably 9 years ago, I said I should figure this out. And I kind of fell deeply into the archive of Mormonism. And I found it spectacularly beautiful and adventurous and strange. And I realized that I was interested in the archive in two ways that set me sort of at odds with what I took to be sort of the major strains of approaching 19th century Mormonism. I wasn't really interested in debunking Mormonism, if you know what I mean. Like, I'm not really compelled by readings that like, well, he really didn't find plates in the ground. Like, I don't read Walt Whitman to debunk him, you know? I don't read Walt Whitman to say like, he actually probably didn't love the men he said he loved or anything like that. That was not a style of reading that appealed to me. Neither, though, was I particularly interested in producing the Mormons, as a lot of their 20th century critics would do, as misunderstood good religionists, as like a basically normative American para-Protestantism in the 19th century that was just misunderstood in its time, and then eventually it was better understood and their persecution stopped. I wasn't really interested in that either, because it seemed to me that wasn't right about the Mormons either, that they did not actually fit the tenets of good religion in ways that were interesting to me. So I wrote this book, and I'm going to try to talk to you a little bit about it, and today's talk is called Heresy, Barbarism, Depravity. So let's start with the man himself. For a number of years, while I was writing the book that would become Make Yourself Gods, I used to give talks with a sexiest, like the sexy-ish title, How the Mormons Became White, which seemed to me a good way to get at both the pervasive racialization of the Mormons across the 19th century, which we'll talk about, but also to set us on the path to answering another knottier category unraveling sort of question, which is this: why is it that what was required of the early states in order to forestall annihilation, extermination, as Governor Boggs would famously put it, why is it that what was required of the saints in order to gain admittance at last into the American empire of white legitimacy was not, say, the derogation of Black capacities for devotion, they had that, was not a willingness to make war on indigenous people, they had had that, but rather was, of course, as you know, an alteration in the structures of intimate life, the renunciation of polygamy. How did sex make right a faltering whiteness? And what does that tell us about what whiteness is? What racialization is in the 19th century United States? This seemed to me a fruitful problem in the archive of early Mormonism, where the saints again and again figured as Indian-like in their treachery, Mohammedan in their sensual indulgence, African or Asiatic in their despotism, slave-like in their sycophancy, as in all, a people whose religiosity made them perverts, made them deviants, and whose perversions made them dubious white people, across a recursive circuitry of delegitimating implication. So the book that I wrote, and that's me before, I was very happy to be doing this. It gave me an occasion to get my haircut and put on a tie. So the book I wrote, it tries to tell that story. The book Make Yourself Gods tries to tell that story and to make something of that recursive circuitry legible. That is, it tells the story of the Mormons from the period of their emergence as a dissident sect, notable as much for their heterodoxy as for a dramatically non-normative sexual imagination, through to their renunciation of polygamy at century's end. That 1890 renunciation, with which the Mormons would eventually at last attain statehood for Utah, transforming them into reluctant monogamists and enfranchised US subjects, that renunciation marked, too, the culmination of a fantastically vexed history, in which the Mormons had appeared by turns as heretics, sex radicals, American Mohammedans, racialized refugees, anti-imperialists, colonizers, and eventually enfranchised subjects, protected in their citizenship less by the secular state's offer of official toleration, I would say, than by the complex wages of a sovereign whiteness at last attained. Now, since this is a series on whiteness, let me say up front that attained whiteness was not some self-evident, basically bioethnic fact about the Mormons, was not some inborn status that had been cruelly or unjustly withheld from them by their Protestant rivals. That is, it seems to me, a misapprehension, and a rather grave one, of the mechanics of racialization, which is something that, in fact, the Mormon story helps us to see with truly crystalline clarity. For what could better demonstrate to us than the Mormon story, hinging as it does on sex? What could better demonstrate to us that whiteness in 19th century America involved more than phenotype, Anglo-European lineage, bloodlines, or for that matter, a willingness to indulge in racist abuse and settler colonial violence, which of course the Mormons had demonstrated. Whiteness was rather civilizational, which is to say it was a matter also of specific relations to gender, to sex, and to what I will call proper devotion. This is the pitch of the book, you could say. It is not only that the Mormons, with their theology of radical theology of embodied life, which I'll talk about in a moment, were in certain precise ways I wanted to specify deviant, were understood as queer, like a queer population before the advent of hetero and homosexuality as sexual taxonomies. It's also that Mormon depravity was read most commonly as both cause and effect of a derangement in the sphere of devotion, of what we might call simply bad belief, as a failure in all to hew to the coordinates of religion as they came to be assembled under the aegis of a civilization structuring metaphysics, whose nearest single designation is, I think, secularism. Secularism. That's really where the book is at. Speaking in concert with a wealth of practitioners of what gets called post-secular critique. There they are, Talal Assad, Joan Scott, John Modern, Sabah Mahmood, others. The book uses the story of the Mormons to vivify a counterposition about what secularism is. Not what results from the dissolution of religion in public life. We live in a secular modernity. There's plenty of religion in public life. Not the happy extirpation of benighted orthodoxy. Secularists like to describe the world as, oh, we used to be orthodox and superstitious, but then we became rational and that was a great triumph. No, nor quite a climate of pluralistic, fragilized belief or a scene of fair play among multiplying possibilities for devotion in a rationalizing and therefore disenchanted and therefore liberated world. These are all the ways that secular moderns like to tell the story of secularism, and I actually would encourage you not to believe any of them. The Mormon story brings into exceptional focus a contrary rendering of secularism as something else, as something nearer a normative, disciplinary, and above all, a racializing sociality. One that specializes in the propagation of a hard distinction, not between the religious and the non-religious. Again, religions flourish in a secular world. Specializes in propagating a distinction not between the religious and the non-religious, but between good religion, those religions that accord with the environing presumptions of a solidifying liberal world, and those that do not. And those that do not don't count as religion at all. They count as bad belief, something that deranges and perverts true religion, good religion, proper religion under the aegis of secularism. What does bad belief look like? Why? Listen to Representative Justin Morrill using polygamy and its counterfeited religiosity to argue against Utah statehood in 1856. Quote, under the guise of religion, this people, the Mormons, has established and seek to maintain a Mohammedan barbarism, revolting to the civilized world. Not just barbarism, a Mohammedan barbarism. This is what it means to think of secularism as the metaphysics proper to a settler colonial empire coming to understand itself more and more entirely in the framework of a redemptive liberalism. Secularism then as the story that modernity, like a sententious story that modern liberals like to tell about themselves. This framing, I think, helps us to underscore the interwovenness of sex, race, and religiosity in the context of an American empire that wishes its citizens to understand themselves as liberal, agentive, free. To tell a story otherwise, I think, is to misapprehend whiteness. So that's what I want to do today in the next like half hour. I want to tell you this story, and the story sort of goes like this. And this is the story of the book, which I hope to substantiate these claims about whiteness and empire and religiosity. I want to suggest that the Mormons were ill-suited to secular belonging in 19th century America, less because of any malignant misapprehension of them, though there were plenty of those, than because their own theology, with its institutions and its social forms, and above all, its visions of the fate of the flesh, of embodied life, set them genuinely askance the codes of normative liberal sociality that were solidifying around them. And this ill-fittedness made them, in turn, in the eyes of their countrymen, racialized deviants, fit for annihilation, extermination, in Governor Boggs' words. Now, and the Mormons in turn respond to these assaults not by protesting the order of the racial state, but by professing their own right to belong there, by indeed identifying with the racial state and producing more and more fear around having been misrecognized as not belonging there. And after the renunciation of polygamy, those protestations about their forms of belonging become more and more credible to the nation. So that's the story I'm going to tell in about the next 25 minutes or so. So that's the picture I took from Joseph Smith's study in Nauvoo, looking out at the Mississippi River. This talk has 4 parts. The first one, fortuitously, is called Joy, and this is how we will go. So, all right, here we are. Part 1, Joy. Quickly then, on the point of Mormon theology, allow me to assure you that the Mormons were regarded in the 19th century as deviants. Quote, to speak of all the immoralities and obscenities sanctioned by the Mormon law would be impossible here, says an 1855 editorial to which we will have occasion to return. This is all, I will take this as read. I think you have seen enough of this to know this. My first major point is that Mormon perversity, though it was often read as merely the expression of the carnal avariciousness of its monomaniacal and perhaps sociopathic founders, this is how people who want to attack Mormonism read polygamy. Mormon perversity is in fact rooted in a theology, an intricate cosmology tuned especially closely to the matters of the body and of pleasure and of their worldly import. Polygamy, I want to suggest, is not some inessential temple rite, a merely notional appendage to the more pressing theological insights and doctrinal imperatives that define the faith in its earliest year. It is rather a central provision in Smith's cosmology. How so? Well, briefly, and you'll forgive me for those of you for whom this is familiar terrain. Briefly, at the center of early Mormon cosmology is the ideal of exaltation, the movement of the human toward its destiny in divinity, in Godhead. You have got to learn how to make yourselves gods, Smith would say in 1844. This, Smith would reveal, is the great secret. The culminating secret is not simply that God, in essence, has a biography, that God was a man who became a god, though that is a very fine bit of anti-Calvinist heresy. Nor is it even that God himself had a body and has indeed never surrendered it. And Smith would write variously and dazzlingly about celestialized embodiment, about the divine carnality of God. The secret is not that God is still speaking, that God has a body, or that that God had a body, or that he still has one. It is rather that you yourself, in the grain of your mortal flesh, are living an embodied life that itself bends toward divinization. You have got to learn how to make yourselves gods. Becoming a god, though, is in this dispensation not a matter of redemption or of like a radical translation into the pure otherworldliness of Godhead. Rather, it is a matter of what Smith calls believing and receiving, an arduous coming into relation to the very nearly inconceivable fact that you are, as a living person, a human in the mortal world, already living in the body of a God unenlarged, all spirit is matter, Smith tells us, by which he means that there are not two kinds of flesh, fallen and unfallen, but one, and one only, that to live in a body is to be constituted by, to be made of the same stuff as God. It is to be mantled in divinity. Christianity, one could say as an aside, has conspired in the Smithian view to get you to forget this, in part through its Pauline chastisement of the flesh. Now, here precisely is where polygamy enters the scene. For polygamy, and this is to speak somewhat too quickly, is how you learn how to make yourself a god, how you train your body, not least through the denaturalizing force of its pleasures, to come into the all but inconceivable realization that it is not fallen, that it is not mired in Pauline corruption, but is the very stuff of your incipient divinity. In Smith's cosmology, that is to say, the body is both a revelation and a constant surprise. And so is also, as for someone like Freud, like a kind of challenge, a scene of potential undoing. But what it promises to undo in those passages of disordering delight that are proper to it are precisely those traditions that discipline the body, that induce us to misrecognize the sweetness of embodied living as temptations or deceitful prompts in the direction of sin and crime. This is good doctrine, Smith says. It tastes good. He's speaking of the doctrine of divinization. Deceits, temptation. In Smith, the disordering delights of the body are nothing of this kind. They are rather the harbingers of an order apart from the orthodoxies of either sanctified religion or the managerial rationalizations of the body to which these are increasingly conjoined in secular contexts. Pleasures are rather foretastes of godliness, intimations of an immortality not premised on the transcendence of the flesh. God offers us these revelations of grace, Smith insists, quote, in the view of no eternal dissolution of our earthly tabernacles, or in a more compact formulation, quote, the great principle of happiness consists in having a body, or again, men are that they might have joy. The advent of polygamy in Mormonism is in all these respects not an aberration, but a culmination. Then shall they be gods, Smith says in the polygamy revelation, yoking into tight relation, plural marriage, and exaltation. This is polygamy, I think, in all its theological multifacetedness, as a doctrine making legible a counter-Calvinist vision of the divinity of the mortal body, as a training ground anchored in dailiness for the arduous denaturalization of the Christianized Pauline body, as an intimate form built to recognize rather than rebuke the pleasures of carnality, inasmuch as those pleasures deliver back to us the good, if again only glancingly conceivable news that not only does life transpire in a world not fallen away from divinity, but we ourselves inhabit unfallen flesh, bodies insusceptible to the secular mechanics of disenchantment or reenchantment, because from the first, coterminous with the flesh of God. In polygamy, Smith discovers at last an arrangement of intimate life proper to the outsized carnal capacities, the incipient exaltation of an embodied humankind. It's the way you live out the stunning fact that you are alive in the body of a God unenlarged. Part 2, the less joyful extermination. This then is what I'm talking about when I read Mormonism as a radical theory of embodied life. That's what I see in Mormon theology, about which there is, of course, a great deal to say. To take only the very nearest unparsed dilemma, like, do women also and equivalently inhabit the bodies of gods? Is exaltation a capacity granted only to men? Is the celestial sphere hierarchized, gendered? I would say that despite the seeming clarity of the polygamy revelation, they belong to him. The matter is actually one of great live uncertainty, and we can talk more and at great length, and I write a lot about the question of early Mormon women's relation to the promise of divinization. Still, that's a different talk, which I give at other times. Still, what I'd like to say in this part is like, so given these committed departures from the normative codes of intimate life of 19th century America, commitment to polygamy, it is perhaps not much of a surprise that every decade or so in the mid to late 19th century, the United States, or some non-negligible subset of its population, went to war with the Mormons, with the deviant and seditious Mormons. And we can list these occasions off one by one, each proper named key to the ambition quite plainly stated to exterminate Mormonism. These were the Missouri War of 1838, the Illinois War of 1844, the very nearly annihilating Utah War of 1857. After this, there's the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act of 1862, the Poland Bill of 1874, the Reynolds v. United States decision of 1879, the Edmunds Act of 1882, and finally the Edmunds-Tucker Act of 1887, whereby the polygamous Mormons became a curious species of sexual outlaw, committing crimes against monogamy and the sanctified national order for which it stood. In and through all this, a great proliferating genre of anti-Mormon fulmination came to vivid life, and its terms are remarkable. I think a lot, for instance, of one William P. Richards of Macomb, Illinois, I first discovered in W. Paul Reeves' book. William P. Richards of Macomb, Illinois, who in the teeth of the Mormon expulsion from Illinois after Smith was assassinated, had called for the creation of a section of land to be parceled off and, quote, forever set apart and known and designated as the Mormon Reserve. This is in 1844. The Indian Removal Act had been signed into law about a decade earlier in 1830, though the Seminole War was still going on. The Mormon Reserve. Removal, resettlement, reservation, mob violence, land seizure, forced migration, accusations of heathenishness. These are the recurrent tropes of early anti-Mormonism. So we can say, at the very least, that the Mormons' persistent and multivalent departures from the governing codes of intimate life were not lost on their countrymen. They were, to the contrary, registered again and again in the shifting idioms of racialization, whereby the Mormons were made over into a racially dubious populace, poisoned in body by orthodoxy and erring belief, figuring by alternating turns, again, as Indian, Mohammedan, as African or Asiatic despots, as slave-like sycophants to domineering theological masters. This is the hyperbolized and multivalent racialization of the Mormons that we see in the 19th century. But the Mormons, I want to suggest, were hardly silent in response to these multifaceted and interwoven accusations, these declines in the metrics of the national imaginary to the status of expendable life. And in response, the Mormons do more than defend polygamy, though they do that, as we'll see. And they do more than speak up for their own righteousness as colonizers, as redeemers of the savage West, though they do that. They do more than speak up for themselves as good subjects who well know the necessity of racial hierarchy in the realm of political authority, though they do this too. Negroes shall not rule us, Young famously says in 1852, in acts of law denying priesthood authority to African Americans. They do all this. Still more strikingly, it seems to me, over the course of the violent century, the course of the later 19th century, the Mormons look to mobilize all the vagrant and under-systematized elements of Smith's Mormon theology toward the pole of normativity, toward the guise, if not the fact, of a virtuous, if tenuous, and basically liberal citizenry. They grapple with their losing place in 19th century America's racializing order by professing themselves in certain ways more normative than the just merely normal, producing a strategy of distinction through, in essence, hypernormativity. Let me tell you what I mean. To take the example of plural marriage, the Mormons were quick to defend polygamy by insisting not on its perversity or on its origins in a divinized body, but rather on the hyperbolized gender normativity it propagated, such as here. In tracts by Pratt, by Udney Hay Jacobs, and others, a pro-polygamy line emerged. One conspicuously not anchored in the divinizing body, one conspicuously not genealogizing the advent of polygamy in the way I just have, saying it's rooted in a vision of the body. No, 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 the Mormons said in many voices. No, this plural marriage merely looks to you like perversion. The practice of plural patriarchal marriage merely seems to conjugate a pleasure-fired proto-divine body that violates the codes of secular being and belonging, and in this way renders Mormonism as something apart from religion and nearer to bad belief. No, 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 no. Rather, the line went. Rather, polygamy is a practice rooted not in pleasure, but in bioreproductivity. One that in this way amounts finally, and these are in fact the words of a contemporary historian named Richard Bushman, to a family theology after all. That's Bushman. The Mormon, he reads polygamy as something that put family first. And better still, that is to say, this is exactly what the 19th century Mormons, defenders of polygamy, are saying. Better still, the 19th century defenders say it is a practice, plural marriage, that corrects the declining patriarchy of the Gentile world by propounding the godlier, holier, more absolutely hierarchized patriarchal order of plural patriarchal marriage. Let no woman unite herself in marriage with any man, Orson Pratt had written, unless she has fully resolved to submit herself wholly to his counsel and to let him govern as the head, for such is the divine order of family government. Brigham Young, as you can see, turned the point rather more directly. There is no woman on the face of the earth that can save herself, he declaimed. But if she ever comes into the celestial kingdom, she must be let in by some man. God knew what Eve was. He was acquainted with woman thousands and millions of years before. Now, there's a lot to say about this, and I'm not really particularly interested in the psychologized readings of like, oh, this is particular to Young's distaste for women, or for that matter, his distaste for Afrikaners. I think that's wrong. I think he is actually trying to make a case for Mormons' declining place in civilizational logic of whiteness. If Bushman's, let me explain what I mean. If Bushman's account makes for a kind of de-perverting misreading, and I think it does, it nevertheless reminds us of how crucial gender and the insistence on the hard supposed fact of a hierarchized gender difference was to be for racialized visions of civilization and of the proper comportment of civilized people. As a scholar like Kyla Schuler acutely reminds us in her very great book about the biopolitics of feeling, in 19th century anthropology, sexual differentiation, gender difference, was understood as the attainment of uniquely civilized populations. One of the foremost markers, that is, of racial advancement. Uncivilized societies blurred genders, and the more anthropologically advanced your society was, the harder the distinctions between gender and the more clarified the hierarchies between gender. To fail at gender differentiation was to fail at civilization. So what merely looks like perversity, Mormon defenders would insist again and again, is actually the reverse, is actually a sublime and hyper-civilizational commitment to gender difference, a commitment to hierarchy in the sphere of gender. Call it the patriarchal sublime. This, the Mormons insist, would differentiate them from, for instance, the barbaric, if also polygamous, Indians. The Indians may have been polygamous, but of course, unlike the Indians, the Mormons were patriarchs. The Mormons insisted on patriarchy, and this is what made them civilizationally different. This is what secured their claim to whiteness. Um, and I would say again, as a sidebar, that like de-eroticizing accounts of polygamy essentially repeat verbatim Mormon self-defenses in the 19th century. And they sort of, in 20th century versions of like just revisit them with a great deal of sort of like credulity, like, oh, this must be the case. So I would encourage you to think otherwise. Part 3, hypernormativity, or proto-homo-nationalism. For the Mormons, there's a lot riding on these claims. There's a lot riding on the insistence on these normative counter possibilities, the insistence that in fact they are civilizationally normative and not the perverts that they're being mistaken for. For they had, after all, the Mormons had, after all, in a range of interwoven ways, made themselves available for delegitimation, and not only via the obvious scandal of polygamy. Just to take another example, for Mormonism was also, from the first, spectacularly entangled with indigeneity, and indigeneity itself not easily deracialized. Think only for a moment about the Mormon sacred text, the Book of Mormon. It is a work that on its face seems just conventionally, ordinarily racist in its distinctions, with good guy white Nephites doing battle with the accursed dark-skinned Lamanites in an epic race war. And that's like a familiar way of reading the Book of Mormon, you know, like Old Testament fan fiction tuned to the bigotries of settler colonial America. I don't think that's right, though. I think that's a misreading of the Book of Mormon. For it was a text that was nevertheless taken up by the Mormons and others as a species of anti-imperial critique. As devout Mormon readers were themselves quick to recognize, the Book of Mormon tells a declension story, a story about the decimation of the white Nephites, a story about imperial hubris and the steep decline of a once righteous people overthrown by their own pride. It was a story in all of self-blindedness, backsliding, of how empires fall. For refugee Mormons, the analogies were easy to read. I am prophet enough, Brigham Young declaimed in 1849, to prophesy the downfall of any of the government that has driven us out. In just these terms, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, a guy named Garland Hunt, wrote back to DC in May of 1855 that the Mormons, he warned, have created a distinction in the minds of the Indian tribes of this territory between the Mormons and the people of the United States, and their first object will be to teach these savages that they are the rightful owners of the American soil and that has been wrongly taken from them by the whites. This, what Hunt is saying, was the anti-imperial critique of the Book of Mormon materialized, come to frightening life in the West. Now, the Mormons did indeed sustain fraught quasi-identifications with Native peoples. And these were crossed with unlikely commonalities. Both Mormons and Natives were, as I have mentioned, non-monogamous. Both were understood by their countrymen to be zealots, heathens, in fact. And both thought of themselves as sovereign peoples, as peoples whose right to self-governance exceeded the powers of the secular United States. Now, these are all the forms that link Native peoples to Mormons in the 19th century. If these identifications were, for the Mormons, in a certain way, scripture at least, compulsory, you'll know that a Mormon term for Native people was brother layman. They were also, in lots of ways, intolerable, not to be allowed to pass. Consider in this that editorial I was talking to you about, the editorial from Putnam's Monthly. It was entitled simply, "The Mormons." Monogamy, we are told, is sanctioned by our religion, but it goes beyond our religion. Monogamy does not only go with the Caucasian race, the Europeans and their descendants. Beyond Christianity, it goes beyond common law. It is one of the elemental distinctions, historical and actual, between European and Asiatic humanity. It is one of the pre-existing conditions of our existence as civilized white men. Strike it out, and you destroy our very being. And when we say our, we mean our race. Religion and beyond religion. These are the coordinates within which this editorial moves. Notably, what italicizes the editorialists' disgust is not Mormon theology, or not quite, nor is it precisely the mere fact of Mormon erotic errancy, though this is indeed the occasion for a lot of fulsome performance of horror. Rather, because of their derangements of normative intimacy, which are themselves wholly entangled with a set of devotional practices the devious Mormon leadership has conspired to counterfeit as religion, the Mormons figure here as race traitors, sliding in the metrics of national life from the realm of potential citizens to that of expendable life. Whatever we might incline to call religion and sex are not separate integers here. They are not distorting mirrors in which the hard facts of lineage or phenotype appear in like illogical combination. It's not like, I'm not convinced by claims like it's weird that the Mormons were being racialized because they were really white. No, this is what race is. This editorial is a demonstration of what race is. It walks us through the conceptual grounding points through which expendability and non-expendability and the degrees of distinction between them are given their substance. So when a Jack London character declares they ain't white, they're Mormons, when he insists, in essence, that the devotional practice of polygamy is racializing, we are not in the presence of any like weird failure of logic or reason. We are bearing witness rather to racialization, to what I call in the book the biopolitics of secularism, to the fused disciplinary calibration of sex, racial status, and religiosity that would shape itself into hegemonic coherence in the latter half of the 19th century. And by the way, none of this would be lost on native peoples. Here is the Code of Indian Offenses, which I offer to you to read, in which you'll see that from the perspective of the state, the native crimes against civilization, many of which they share quite precisely with the Mormons, were not solely about property or sex or heathenish dances or feasts in and of themselves. They were rather, and quite explicitly, those native crimes against civilization, a fused compound of erotic depravity, disordered intimate and therefore economic life, and committed heathenishness, with each element coming into salience as it ratified the others. This is the racializing discipline of imperial secularism. This is what it looks like. It seems to me there is, in this context, the context of the racializing discipline of imperial secularism, little to surprise us in the desperate urgency of the Mormon avowals of normativity scaling toward a kind of hypernormalcy. Little to surprise us in their defenses of polygamy, not as perversion but familialism, not rupture but deep tradition, not anchored in divinized embodiment but bioreproduction and gender difference. Nor, for that matter, is there much to surprise us in the extravagances of Mormon racism under Brigham Young, the redoubled commitments to the exclusion of African Americans, abandonments of hopes to convert the Lamanites, escalating identification with the political orders of the racial states, or in the afterlives in what a great scholar named Jared Hickman calls Mormonism's, quote, deplorable record of theological racism. In all of this great mosaic of Mormon self-transformations over the course of the 19th century, we can hear a familiar trope of fragilized American whiteness, a straining disidentificatory effort not to be mistaken for non-white, not to be misapprehended as the Indians they resemble with their perversities, their backwardness, their a-civilizational arrangements of life. These insistences, rather these counter-insistence on hypernormativity, are part of the long labor of shoring up the everywhere contested whiteness of the Mormons of themselves, a labor undertaken in the belief, the quite correct belief, that without whiteness, there could be no hope for sovereignty in whatever meager or compromised form. The fate of the Lamanites in the West gave a especially vivid testament to the cataclysm of failed sovereignty in the imperial United States. Indeed, The Mormons finally renounced polygamy in the fall of 1890, precisely 2 months before the culminating massacre of the Lakota at Wounded Knee. And they do so, the Mormons make this renunciation in Woodruff's word, proclaiming in Woodruff's words that they have become, quote, politically speaking, a ward or dependent of the American state. When he's saying we have to do this because we're a ward or a dependent of the American state, when he describes Mormons in precisely the terms with which Native people were described, their the dependency and their wardhood. It's just an absolutely remarkable phrase. His remarks diagnose with eerie precision how the Mormons understood themselves to have been, in effect, Indianized, marked out as expendable life, made wards of the state, made fit for extermination. It's in these senses that the Mormons speak to me quite forcefully as an early iteration of what queer theorist Jasbir Puar calls homo-nationalism, which I can talk about as much as we wish. They are pioneers, that is, in their efforts to destigmatize their own religious erotic or religious sexual errancy through the fervent performance of a countervailing normativity in the insistence of gender hierarchies, and in the championing of precisely the racial entitlements proper to the white imperial state. They identify with the white imperial state. So no, there's nothing wrong with racialized statecraft. We're just being misrecognized. We belong in that. If transforming themselves into a new religion was what was needed to enter that state, a post-polygamist religion, one that had jettisoned its pleasure-fired body, speeding toward Godhead and its celestialized carnality, trading it out wholly for a family theology, this they would do. And they would emerge as precisely good religion. The American religion, Harold Bloom likes to say, which is to say, they would emerge as a religion tolerable by the lights of secularism. Now, we might read this as a story about the wondrous munificence of tolerant, liberal inclusiveness, of the munificent force of American liberal secularism. Look, see how a place at the table of good religion can be set even for such oddballs as the Mormons. Or you could read here something of the transformative disciplinary force of American secularism as a disciplinary, in the key of disciplinary racialization. My own reading is, of course, the latter. Okay, conclusion. I give you this quote from Talal Asad, who is very, very important to me. Now, it's sort of by way of conclusion. It's common, and it's not unfair, to think of the early Mormons as victims of a pervasive and indeed a killing persecution. It's not unfair because, as I've mentioned, persecuted they were. But I want to suggest to you in conclusion that the rescaling of Mormon history around the tipping point of the renunciation of polygamy, when Mormons achieve their first real comedy with the United States of America, can have some very distorting effects, which themselves get fed back into the impulse to read the Mormons as victims of what is often called religious intolerance. Histories of the saints, as you know, and especially the church's own, like to regard the early years as a kind of triumphant passage through hardship, as indeed what Jan Ships will say becomes post-polygamy the sacred history of Mormonism. Smith's revelations, the buried plates, the miraculous production of the Book of Mormon, the expansion of the church, the years of dire persecution, the building of temples, assassination, exodus, the handcart disaster, the colonization of the West, the surviving through threats, multiple and grave. These are the stations in the progress of the Mormon sacred history. And where they arrive is at this wonderful achieved comedy between themselves and those very United States to which for so long they were so reluctant to belong. It's a way of telling this way of telling the story that ends with achieved comedy. It's a way of telling the story of early Mormonism that effectively consecrates American national belonging as internal to Mormonism, an aspect of its inner truth as the secret destiny it labored to bring to fulfillment. In this way of telling the story, the destiny of sacred time is American belonging. This framing, I think, etches into early Mormonism a trajectory toward the premises of liberal personhood that its own theology and its own practices had struggled often bitterly to dislodge. And this is really my impatience with liberalizing accounts of the Mormons, accounts that want to make them into good liberals, that make polygamy just family friendly and women partisans of the vote rather than say equal Godhead, or make racialization a matter of illogical disdain for Mormon belief. Like, the Mormons were not secular liberals, which was a point upon which they were quite willing to insist unto their own persecution. And they were indeed persecuted into becoming so, which makes me again impatient with the desire to produce them as already good liberal subjects. When one does, all the bracing and unruly counter possibilities in early Mormonism that means so much to me, those strains that had been anti-imperial, those that had suggested a different fate for the body than, say, rationalized familial reproduction, or a different future for women than just queenly accompaniment to godly men, all those counter possibilities grow fainter and fainter, harder to see, harder to hear, with the effect that the historical density of the Mormon drive toward whiteness gets flattened into either bland psychologizing about Young just didn't like African Americans, or into redemptive moralization. The story of the early saints and their entanglement with the American empire of white monogamy is in fact weirder and harder and less consoling than that. And it's on those terms that I commend it to you. All right. That's that.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Professor Coviello, for a fantastic,
Dude, thank
provocative,
you.
and wide-reaching presentation. Even if everybody were to pop up immediately and start clapping, the Zoom platform would only allow us to hear the loudest person clapping at a time. But I'm sure
It's weird.
I'm sure I'm not the only person who found this presentation really fascinating and inspiring.
Dude, that's very kind.
Yeah, well, thanks again. So if everybody who is a part of the reading group surrounding the speaker series wouldn't mind bringing yourselves back into view, and for those of you watching elsewhere on YouTube who might have missed our brief introduction,
Should I stop the screen share so we can see more of one another?
Oh, sure, that sounds nice.
Does that sound good? Okay, let's see.
There
we go.
That's great. Thank you so much. Those of you who are watching on YouTube, if you want to pose any questions, please do so in the chat window, and I will do my best to get to you. So I guess, let's just jump right in with comments, questions, or points of consideration from the students. Who would like to kick us off? Samuel.
Awesome. Thank you. So thank you, Dr. Coviello, for presenting on this. It's a really interesting topic.
Oh, man, thanks.
I've got a question specifically about secularist America today, post-secular America today, and the rhetoric they use. So I noticed a lot of the quotes that used to highlight how secular Americans in the 19th century disparaged Mormons and their religion. They read very reminiscent of how some sections of America today discuss Islam and talk about Islam. So has the rhetoric of secular America changed at all? Or, because to me, it doesn't seem like it has, but I don't know. I would love your opinion on this.
Samuel, let me first say that's a great question. One of the things it does is allow me to say that, like, post-secular critique, which is a critical discourse to which I'm really tremendously indebted, itself is rooted in an effort to think through like a global pandemic of anti-Islamism. The production of Islam as just the opposite of liberal subjecthood. So it seems to me different from saying, have the grammars of secularism changed? Of course they have. The grammars of secularism have changed because the internal grammars of liberal sociality and liberal statehood have changed, right? But it seems to me that the fundamental structure that someone like Assad points out, that a universalizing liberalism establishes itself not by the annihilation of religion, but by the cleaving of religion into beneficent versions and maleficent versions, is very ongoing. And what we can see often are struggles on the behalf of subgroups of practice to get themselves recognized as good religions, to insist that they hew more closely to the paradigms of virtuously liberal life. And one can see too that those that fail to do so are racialized, that they will look always suspiciously racial. Similarly, racialized populations' practices of devotion seem suspiciously non-secular, one can equally say. And one could think here with Sylvester Johnson and like just think a lot about great scholarship, Winifred Sullivan, on Black religiosity. Yeah. But that's
Awesome.
Samuel,
Thank
that's
you
a
so much.
truly great question.
Absolutely. One of my own questions as well. Who would like to follow up? Yes, Eric, please.
Okay, my question was actually pretty similar.
Yeah.
And I mentioned that in page 175 of your book, you write
Oh,
that
man.
the Mormons are a people disciplined out of their devotionally charged carnality into monogamy and eventually into the secular American whiteness. And I was wanting to ask if, especially in relation to Islam today and other beliefs that are considered bad beliefs, are we going to see a similar effect on these beliefs where Islam will have to be reformed in order to become compatible with modern day secularism, or is there a way that they can both coexist?
Oh man, dude, like it seems to me like we won't get to see, we just see all the time. We just see all the time. And one of the things to say about the secular distinction between good religion and bad religion is not just about like bodily practices or racialization inside religions. It's also about religious comportments to publicity and to public life, so that if you have a religion that believes it can make a claim on public life and is not sufficiently privatized, that will be the subject of a kind of derogation. Like it'll suddenly seem like fundamentalism or credulity or something like that. And those things happen all over the place. I mean, just like, dude, you can every day you can pick up a paper and read someone questioning whether Islam is a religion at all, whether Sharia law is taking over the state of Oklahoma, like whether a practice of devotion will be mistaken for a public claim, which is only permissible to those. Assad has this great phrase, just great killing phrase, like the secular state will tolerate those religions that make no claims on life. That is to say, that allow whatever the secular state's vision of the proper arrangements of socialities, publics and privates in life to remain undisturbed. Those that do not will have to do a complicated dance. Oh, sorry, someone had a question, I think.
Yeah, who's next? Yes, Nathan, please.
I guess so. I'm interested in light of the analysis that you do about, the patriarchal sublime, about, agreement with the racialized state as strategies to boost Mormon credibility, even in the face of their deviancy in the 19th century. I'm interested in how you would apply that same analysis to moments in the 20th century. I'm thinking the rise of the civil rights movements and feminisms in the 60s and 70s, where Mormons are very resistant to at that time period, and how that, I don't know, how you would look at that through your analysis of like how these strategies were developed in the 19th century, how they weren't given up, and even in like this refraction of the 19th century in Mormon history as like this sees liberalization? How does that change when like liberal norms change in the 20th century?
Nathan, that's again a wonderful question. I'm gonna begin with this sort of unsatisfying disclaimer, which is that I, honest to God, begin knowing so much less about the Mormons after 1896. Like after 1896, my knowledge about Mormonism like plummets in a truly breathtaking way. I will say, as an aside, which I often say, like. A spectacularly, like if I had the gifts of a historian, which I paradigmatically do not, the sort of social history I would want to tell would be that of Salt Lake and its environs between 1896 and the great nationalizing movement of World War I, 1919. And I would just wonder, oh my God, what's that like? Like, what's it like to live inside a sociality where a number of the anchoring structures had been suspended and revised? Kathleen Flake writes about this from the national scale very largely, but I'm thinking about like locally. What was that like to then be folded into the American nation? Turbulent, I would imagine, though its details escape me. I will say that at the end of the book, I end up talking a lot about the shifting patterns of what it seems to me as like Mormon professions of fealty to the liberal state. So, for instance, and again, that's not that is what it is. Sometimes that looks like progress, and sometimes that looks like regressiveness. So, for instance, you have not failed to notice that in the last couple of years, the church has made a lot of progress. Like, we are against racism.
Yeah.
Racism is a sin. This seems to me to respond particularly to kind of a post-Charlottesville moment of white supremacist noxiousness. And the church very clearly wants to position itself as part of a global liberal order, because the church's viewpoint now, as you know, is conspicuously global. And it does not wish to be identified with white supremacism because it thinks of the basic premises of global liberalism as anti-racist. At the same time, it's had to do a very delicate set of maneuvers around queerness and transness, and its commitment to family theology has been unbelievably vexing in that way. Unbelievably vexing in that way. And, you know, again, I cannot do what I do without the like heroic labor of people in Mormon studies, from whom who all, first of all, have forgotten more than I will ever know, and B, who make possible everything I think. But I'm not really of Mormon studies because I'm not keen to apologize for that. I don't think the proclamation on the family
Peter, could you repeat? You said, I don't think the proclamation on the family, and we're all on the edge of our seats.
Yeah, no, you were just building to this great point and then it cut.
All right, well, Peter is reconnecting, I think, that's what's happening here. And we knew that these sorts of technical glitches might be inevitable. I do want to get a sense of who else has a question so that when he pops back, we can continue. Let's see, I see Brett. And Sean in Virginia. Eric has another question as well. And there are at least a couple of questions that we can deal with over here from the YouTube chat. I do want to put also, while we're stalling and pretending like everything is fine, I do want to return to a term that Peter brought up near the first third of his presentation that I think speaks to a lot of the questions that you all have been asking so far. And that is when he suggests that 19th century anti-Mormonism reveals how American secularism is a case of what he calls a redemptive liberalism. And because we tend to think of liberalism and secularism in opposition to religion, this suggests that there is a kind of a deeper structural similarity, even an identity, between what is called liberalism or what is called secularism and what is called religious belief. And so it's, I think, interesting for us to think about anti-Mormonism not itself as a kind of anti-religious position, but as Peter has been insisting upon, an anti-bad religion position. And then to consider as well the ways in which responding to the sort of, not so much the demonization as the sort of, let's call, I don't know, the abnormalization, the deviantization of Mormons and Mormon religion, led to a kind of, rather than initially kind of digging in of the heels, but then a sort of a pivot, almost 180-degree pivot toward this notion of redemptive liberalism, where there's a kind of insistence on first the de-eroticizing of polygamy, and in so doing also the kind of the sort of disembodying of divinity at the same time, in a way that would become more agreeable to what I guess we could call mainstream, American, relatively Protestant Christianity. And so, again, I'm stalling for time here, but I do think it's so interesting and important to remember, and Peter says this throughout his book, while this book pertains to Mormonism in the 19th century, it's actually a book about American secularism, and one that reveals that secularism is, in fact, not so secular, that it is built on a series of assumptions about sexuality, about race, and about religion that are anything but rationally, scientifically, or material grounded, that represent a kind of a sort of religion in a new guise, or religion under another name. So, okay, I see also that Evan has a question as well. Is that right? In addition to who was the first person that we had called on? Brett, right. So before we get to those questions, can I just hear a little bit more from the group as a whole about the sort of place of secularism in Peter's analysis in the reading itself, and the way in which you responded to it, either gutturally or intellectually, and what it enriches about your understanding of the history at stake here. Yeah, Eric.
Yeah, so, and Peter actually touched on this in response to my question, but one thing that I noticed, and that I have noticed over the years, is that secularist views on religion aren't so much determined by the beliefs themselves as by how those beliefs encroach on society. And for example, with Islam itself, when people talk about Islam, their first criticism is how they're terrorists, how they have minorities who are very radical, and the reason they do that is because they perceive a terrorist minority as a threat to themselves and to their society. By contrast, the hyper-patriarchal structure of Islam and its oppression of women receives comparatively little attention. And so I think just noticing patterns like that, I've speculated that liberal critique of or a secular critique of religion stems not so much from the beliefs themselves as whether those beliefs encroach on the public, as Peter touched on in his response.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And welcome back, Peter. How was your
Friends,
break?
I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry. It was a little frantic, but that's fine.
Okay, well, we're glad that everything has worked out. And so we were just having a conversation about the nuances in the concept of secularism that I said we were having a conversation. I was just spinning my wheels in hopes that not too many people abandoned us until you rejoined us. But
I feel like I did Nathan wrong. Like I was about to say something about the proclamation on the family, and then I was like,
that's right. Yeah, can you return to that point, if you don't mind?
I don't know, man. Can I was probably saying something like I am unpersuaded by accounts of the proclamation as a finally capacious and generous sort of document. And the trans and queer people who I would think of as my allies would share that want of persuasion. And I think the tendency to describe it as such is a version of making Mormonism more accommodated to the versions of global liberalism that the church wants. Again, I would want to say about secular, post-secular critique, like the point of which is not like don't have a critique of religion. That's not the point. Like often when you do, if you're in my business, right, if you're in this very like secular queer world, the point of post-secular critique isn't like, all religion is cool, man, and you should leave all those social structures alone. No, it is much rather that like, say, for instance, one might have a critique, though the form of its substance oughtn't to be, the problem with this is that it's religious, because that always produces an alibi for secular. So, for instance, one can hear a lot about the patriarchality of Islam, which I think for many American women would be quite a surprise to know that secular America is so gloriously free of patriarchal hierarchy and discrimination. Like, in other words, secular, you employ secular critique to back away from liberalism's constantly self-universalizing alibis for itself. That would be a that would be a way of thinking about what purchase you can gain on the world through post-secular critique. It's not to encourage you like, well, if something's a religion, you oughtn't to have any, or you're disabled from any form of critique of the sociality as imagines and the way it distributes genders and races. Stuff like that would not be the point of it. The point would be to not default to the settings of putative liberal pluralism.
I think this is a great opportunity to pivot toward a question from the YouTube chat, which may be
great.
This very issue from the opposite direction. So my colleague Krista Albrecht Crane says, I understand better now in what way mainstream Mormons express abhorrence of polygamy and just want to be seen as regular Americans, super Americans, in fact, very patriotic and devoted to that. However, she says Mormons are still seen as a sect by other established Christian groups in the US, in a way as bad religion. What is one to make of that dynamic within Christian faith groups?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. One of the things that really surprised me when I began researching Mormonism is how, like, remember when Romney was, of course you will remember when Romney was running for president, and a lot of like evangelicals were like, yeah, man, no. Like, I realized that there's a real strong evangelical reading, which is not a wrong one, but the Mormons is like, they're not Protestants, they're actually counter-Protestants. They think of Protestantism as like apostasy in a real way. That's a not weak reading of 19th century Mormonism. So that's one thing to say. Another thing to say, though, is that if what I'm suggesting to you is right, if bad belief is perverting and perversions look like bad belief and misbegotten whiteness in this recursive circuitry, the Mormons know as well as anyone what it is like to have been marked out at whatever period of their devotional past as deviant. And the possibility of deviance hums beneath the surface of all the sort of like pop culture sunny stolidity of Mormon culture. The possibility of being recognized and derogated as deviant seems to me a constant presence in the many-faceted Mormon performances of hypernormativity. Of course, the problem with performances of hypernormativity is they're never convincingly normative. To perform hypernormativity is to always be giving the game away. And it seems to me that the Mormons toggle vividly in exactly the space that the questioner has asked about. Like, the Mormons toggle between what Bloom calls, quite properly, the American religion most devoted to Americanness, to the liberal state as such, to capital as such, but also ever ready to shade into their devotionally strange, somehow sexually entangled past. And it seems to me that a lot of the Mormons' performances of an insistent normativity, particularly around queer sex and gender in the 20th century, are all about eradicating the stain of having been marked out in some moment of their devotional past as deviant. Of course, that eradication is never quite going to happen.
Fabulous.
That's a great question.
Yeah, you mentioned Freud briefly, and I can't help but hear in this description that the sort of all-Americanness of contemporary Mormonism is a kind of symptomatic reaction formation against not so much their own polygamist past or the church's polygamist past, but against the excision from the American project by other emergent forms of whiteness that take place there.
Nate, that's a really acute way of saying it to me. It's like, again, I was not prepared for, as a non-Mormon, I was not prepared for the what had been, when I approached it, the tremendously vexed Mormon relation to its own polygamous past, which was one filled with, and you'll hear all the psychoanalytic words like disavowal and misrecognition and stuff like that, and that was very startling to me, again, as someone whose ignorance about Mormonism as little as 20 years ago truly cannot be overstated.
Yeah.
Like Italian Catholic kid from the East Coast who studied queer sex in 19th century American literature. But I will tell you, like the more local story of how I got into this is I had an undergraduate student. I used to teach at a college in the East Coast, and I had this profoundly gifted undergraduate student who wrote this elaborate senior thesis about Joseph Smith, like truly mind-bogglingly brilliant. I really didn't do anything other than say like, yeah, that's great. Anyway, he graduated and he gave me a book that just like, you like Walt Whitman, I think you'd be interested in this. And it was The Essential Joseph Smith. And that student was a person named Jared Hickman, who's now professor of English at Johns Hopkins. And he was my undergraduate. And he just allowed me to think the things that I can think about this because of his like just truly spectacularly intricate conceptual imagination. So that's the more true story of how I get into more. But if you ever run into Jared, he could tell you about the like truly unplumbable depths of my ignorance of Mormonism in as like 2000.
And you know, I have to say, I agree with you. I think Lydia will as well, that we learn so much. My mind is pretty much blown every day when I speak to my students and people who have, you know, a deeper familiarity to some degree with the Mormon faith than I do. And with that in mind, I know that we have a couple more questions on deck from our students. So I believe, Brett, you were the first to have your hand up.
Yeah, my question kind of is along the lines of the question that you actually just answered. But you had talked a little bit about in your book about interrace marriage kind of being this like uncouth act in the eyes of God. And this is actually something, this is something that I heard a lot around the dinner table when I would spend summers with my grandparents who were very devout Mormons. And it was like anybody who participates in that will never inherit the kingdom of heaven. And this was reiterated a lot. And you talked more about the Mormon push on not wanting to be lumped together or associated with Mohammedanism, Indian savagery, Orientalism, Asiatic or Africanist. Do you think that this extensive push to distance themselves from their early theological history has helped to kind of stoke the flames of hyper-patriotism, bigotry, racism, xenophobia, and that sort among some of the contemporary LDS members and subsequently their idea of the culture?
I mean, Brett, that's a hard question for me to answer for a couple reasons. One of which is, again, I genuinely plead a not false ignorance about the intricacies of 20th century Mormon culture. My interest is in like the theological origins of an insistence on whiteness, and I think Young makes that very clear. There's a regrettable way in the book where like Joseph Smith can appear like a kind of hero in the book. He produces all these fecund counter possibilities, and Young kind of ruins it by normalizing things. I'm not quite happy with that. The point would not be that Joseph Smith did not produce like an already patriarchal theological system. It was that he was not a systematizer, and Brigham Young really necessarily was as a colonizer. So that's the first thing I'd say. My interest is really in the theological origins of the 19th century. About the 20th century, look, man, I don't know. Like part of what I'd say is you don't have to have been Mormon to have been raised extravagantly white supremacist. Do you know what I mean? Like it just like that's a kind of like I would be a little like, that's not to, I wouldn't want to say like there's nothing to be said about the history that begins in 1852 and goes up till what is it, 73, when priesthood becomes available to African Americans. Like, I wouldn't want to say there's nothing to be said about that. I would be cautious about the idea that Mormonism is the thing producing white supremacism. You know what's great at producing white supremacism? Like American secular modernity.
Yeah.
So, and Mormonism is, of course, like everything else, in a complex dance with that. So I would want neither to produce an exonerating claim about it, nor one that identified the postures of a horrified white supremacism with Mormonism exclusively, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for that, Brett. I can see that the time is advancing, as it tends to do, and Professor Coviello has been so remarkably generous with us with his time so far.
But for my fading out for 5 minutes, yeah.
All right, yeah, we'll add it to the bill, or whatever from your speaker fee. I know, so I think we have time for one more question, and I know that our technical wizard Evan has something for us.
Yeah. First of all, loved what I read of your book and loved your presentation.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So you obviously took a really deep dive into Mormon studies, and specifically, the study of 19th century Mormonism. In your research, did you find that a lot of the work in this field plays into and legitimizes like this dichotomy between good religion and bad belief in the way that history and beliefs are studied and documented?
I mean, that's an extremely good and difficult question, because again, like there are Mormon scholars in the book who, again, are so much better at Mormonism and its history than I'll ever be, but whose relation to the questions I'm asking was very striking to me, in as much as they seem to labor to try, or they seem to wish to labor to try to produce the Mormons as victims of various kinds of category mistakes in the 19th century. They were misunderstood as domineering patriarchs. They were misunderstood as counter-Protestant religionists, as heretics. They were misunderstood as non-white people. They were really white people. They were misunderstood as sexual deviants. They were really just familial people. And a lot of my research was like, no, dude, they were not misunderstood in those ways. They wished to be understood in those ways. They staked a lot of their own lives on actually a resistance to the secular empire that was surrounding them. And what we see in the 19th century is this vexed battle around accommodation. And Jan Ships is someone who I admire tremendously. All these people I never met, of course. But I think her book is very smart about the sanctification of 19th century history and the effects of it, which sort of, as I tried to say at the end, make an American Mormonism, like a Mormonism that has achieved its peace with the United States, the destiny of Mormonism. What I try to say in my book is that's like a strange backward reading that we should resist, because so much that's fascinating, beautiful, difficult, regressive, frightening, wild, ungovernable about the archive of early Mormonism is truly ill-fitted, it seems to me, to the liberalizing framework that will come with its accommodation to the United States. And I don't want to undersell all that ill-fittedness. When I sort of realized what Smith was saying about the divinizing flesh and how little that found purchase in accounts of Mormonism as but good religion after all, my inclination was not to be dismissive, because these are great scholars, and not even to be critical, just to want to tell a very different story. That's what I'd say. That said, I couldn't tell a story without other truly great scholars like Samuel Brown and Ben Park, and there's a whole bunch of new Taylor Petrie, people doing work that I'm really inspired by. Jared Hickman, of course. So that's once again a bet hedging answer.
A fabulous answer, and I think a fitting conclusion to a fabulous presentation. I hope you all will take a moment to join me in once again thanking Professor
friends.
Coviello for such a fantastic virtual visit, and almost flawless, I think. I also want to remind those of you who are watching from elsewhere that Peter Coviello will be rejoining us at the end of the spring semester for a roundtable conclusion to the speaker series involving him and all of our other future distinguished guests. So I hope you all will join us for those future presentations. And once again in April, details forthcoming. Thanks again to the Center for the Study of Ethics and to Brian Birch, to Evan Jones, and to Lydia Kerr for making this event possible, as well as Boyd Peterson and Brianne Matheson over in the English department. And I hope that you found this conversation as enlivening and fascinating and evocative and provocative as I did. So thank you all once again for...
Thank you. Nick, can I make one pitch
absolutely.
before you go?
Mm-hmm.
Lydia quoted this passage from an essay I wrote long, long ago that I'm very attached to. And I have a book coming out in like a couple months about that novel that begins with exactly the passage that Lydia just quoted. So if you're interested in Thomas Pynchon in a book called Vineland, I don't know, in 2 months, it'll be out in the world from Columbia University Press. There's my pitch. Lydia should have blurbed it.
Yeah. It sounds like there's some sort of infinite jest-esque kind of time bending taking place here as well. The future plagiarizing, the past plagiarizing the future, I think is how it goes. So wonderful. We'll definitely look out for that. That's a really inspiring essay as well, as is so much of your other work. So I'm sure that you've won a lot of converts to the various projects, the many various projects, and really insightful and exciting works that you do, not just on this subject, but on a number of others. So thanks again, everybody. And for those of you on YouTube, join us soon.
Friends, thank you so much. That was truly a joy. Thank you very, very much.
Bye-bye.
Okay, the live stream is cut.